my name's Julia and I thought I would put this video together to try and explain a bit about the pieces that I've put up in the playlist called Ostinato. I think to understand these you probably have to understand a bit about how they were written. So they all started life as quite basic recorded pieces, either for piano alone or for piano and violin. And they were some of the earliest pieces that I wrote. They weren't quite the first, but the way that I did it was basically by recording. So I record something, usually on the piano first, and then improvise lines over it on the violin, or for the later ones on the piano. There was very little notating at that point, at least until I'd recorded something, and then I would transcribe each line so that I could see what was going on. But by and large, I didn't correct anything, so generally whatever I played is what ended up there, whether or not it fits with everything else that's going on. So it was a bit of an experiment. Having got all of these recorded lines, I then used a program called Audacity, which is a free downloadable program, to overlay all of these recordings in different combinations. Occasionally I would offset them, so you'd get a kind of canon effect. But mostly I would just play around with the different combinations. So you end up with these repeating blocks, each of which contains a different combination of these overlaying lines. And it was basically an exercise in trying to maximise the potential of a very limited amount of material, using very basic tools. All it was recordings that I'd done on my phone that I'd then transferred into Audacity. So I tried to play around with ideas like shaping a piece, starting off relatively simply and then building up to something more complex, and lots of the pieces in this playlist follow that kind of a trajectory. Or with ideas of form, for example in the piece called Forest, in which you've got this big section in the middle with a big melody, which is in sharp contrast to the more rhythmic patterns at the start and again at the end. Sometimes I played around with cross rhythms and with the meter, with some of the lines in 3 and others in 2, so you get this interplay between the two different rhythms. And some repeats sound more like they're in one meter than the other. And again, that's something that happens in Forest. It also happens slightly in the one called EGG and at the end of the waltz. In that one, the 2-beat rhythm actually takes over completely, so you lose the waltz effect at the end. Elsewhere, I've tried shifting parts around between different octaves to change the texture or change the prominence of the part. That happens with the piano part in the one called Rainbow. And I've also played around with using different components of the same chords in different repeats, so sometimes you get a much more dissonant version of a chord, whereas in other repeats in exactly the same place you might get something that sounds much more harmonious. I've tried shortening note values of particular lines to build up momentum. That's something that you'll find in the piece called Rain, where the lines that start off as crotchets become repeated quavers and then eventually become semiquavers. So there are lots of ideas there that I was playing with. It was basically my way of experimenting, and in some cases the experiments work and in some cases they don't, but all of the results are there. And the original pieces, the original recordings in the form in which I wrote them are on my website. Some of them sound, well, the recording isn't great on some of them, so some of them don't sound that good, but all of it's there. Then later on, actually earlier this year, once I'd learned a bit more about how to use Logic Pro, I returned to these pieces and started to play around with the texture a bit more by effectively trying to orchestrate them. So I retained the original structure of each, so the combination of lines is exactly the same as in the original versions, but each line I gave to one instrument or one section of the orchestra. Occasionally more than one, but by and large the same line stays within the same section. I wanted to take a fairly minimal approach and see what effect it had on the texture. So, in actual fact, if an orchestra was ever to play any of these, it would probably be quite boring for the players, because all they're doing is playing one line over and over again, or not playing it at all. But that's by the by. Obviously, a little bit of rearranging was necessary, such as transposing up or down an octave for certain instruments. But by and large, they remain pretty close to the originals in structure. One thing I did do after I'd done this was play around a bit with Logic's drummer track feature, mainly because I just wanted to play around with it. I'm not sure it works in every context in which I've used it. Some of the pieces gain a bit of clarity with a beat behind them. For others, it doesn't really work, or it doesn't really add much. But I thought it would be interesting to play around. I didn't really think of these pieces as either classical pieces or as anything else when I wrote them. I was really just playing with ideas. So although the drum beat isn't necessarily something you would find in a classical score, it's much more improvised, I was interested in the effect it might have and how it can change the character of a piece. In some cases, I think it makes them quite meditative. It's an interesting effect, and it was with that kind of an idea in mind that I decided to put them with these slowly expanding images in the videos. I think there's also something quite meditative about those, about the details that you start to notice when you really take time to look, or indeed to listen.